Elara was a woman made of silence and dust. She had arrived in the town of Prosperity Creek a year after her husband's passing, with all she owned in the world packed into a single wagon. There was the horse, Copper, an old gelding with a coat the colour of a worn penny. There were her father's tools, heavy and dark with the oil of 100 projects, each one nested in its own felt-lined slot in a massive wooden chest. And there were the journals. 37 leather-bound volumes filled with her father's precise, angular script. He had been a geological engineer, a man dismissed by his peers as an eccentric, a man who believed the future of building lay not in reaching for the sky, but in listening to the earth. He had spent his life studying ancient, forgotten structures. He documented the wind-scoured stone cities of desert peoples and the sod-roofed longhouses of northern tribes. He believed modern man had grown arrogant, building flimsy boxes of wood that stood in defiance of nature rather than in concert with it. Elara had inherited his belief. It was all she had left of him. She purchased the most useless plot of land in the valley, a steep, south-facing hill that no one wanted because it was too rocky to farm and too steep to build upon with any ease. The townsfolk thought her a fool for it, a quiet, grieving fool. They watched her that first spring as she did not clear a foundation or fell trees for a cabin. Instead, she began to dig. She had a plan, drawn from the meticulous diagrams in Journal 17. It was a design for an earth-sheltered dwelling, a home that would not stand upon the land, but become part of it. It would be cut directly into the face of the hill, using the earth itself as insulation and the bedrock as its foundation. After a month of surveying and marking lines with chalk and string, she went to the town hall. Mayor Thompson sat behind a desk made from a single, massive slab of polished pine. He was a man who measured progress in board feet and saw the valley's future in the clear-cutting of its ancient forests. Elara laid her father's blueprints on his desk. "I am filing my building plan," she said, her voice low and steady. The mayor squinted at the intricate drawings of ventilation flues, retaining walls, and geothermal mass calculations. He did not understand them. He saw only a hole in the ground. "Ma'am," he began, a condescending smile touching his lips. "This appears to be a plan for a root cellar." "It is a home," Elara corrected him gently. Mayor Thompson chuckled. He pushed the plans back across the desk. "In Prosperity Creek, we build proper homes, log cabins, timber frames. We have the finest wood in the territory. We do not live in holes like badgers." "It is the safest way," she insisted. "My father's research proves—" "Your father?" he interrupted. "Was he a builder here?" "He was an engineer." "An engineer of dirt, it seems," the mayor snorted. He stood, signalling the end of the meeting. "Build a proper cabin, widow. Or don't. But the town won't be sanctioning any burrows." The word stuck. The story of the quiet widow and her burrow spread from the town hall like a stain. It became the town's favourite piece of gossip, a source of easy amusement. Mr. Sterling, the owner of the lumber mill, heard it and laughed the loudest. He had just completed his own masterpiece, a 2-story mansion of gleaming timber and glass that sat on the opposite ridge, a monument to his own success and the town's prosperity. "A grave for a living woman," he declared to the men at the saloon. "She intends to bury herself out of grief." The men nodded, drinking their whiskey. It made a sad sort of sense to them. Dr. Albright, the town's only physician, lent the mockery a veneer of scientific authority. He was a man of textbooks and freshly printed diplomas from an Eastern college. "Living underground is terribly unhealthy," he explained to the women's auxiliary at the church. "The dampness seeps into the lungs, It breeds melancholy and sickness. It is utterly unscientific. Humans require sunlight and fresh air, not the stale atmosphere of a tomb." His words were repeated over tea and at the general store. The project was officially christened Elara's Folly. The children who passed her hill on their way to fish in the creek would chant it. "Elara's Folly, dark and deep, where the lonely widow goes to weep." Soon, a new phrase entered the local vernacular. When a man made a foolish investment or embarked on a doomed project, his friends would shake their heads and say he was digging his own burrow. Elara heard the whispers. She saw the pointed fingers and the smirks. She ignored them all. She had the work to do. The work was brutal. Every morning, as the sun broke over the eastern ridge, she was already there, her face smudged with dirt, her hands raw. She and Copper were a team. She would break the earth with a pickaxe, its rhythmic thunk, 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 echoing in the quiet air. Then she shoveled the loosened soil onto a heavy stone boat, a simple sledge her father had designed. Copper, straining in his harness, would drag the load down the hill to be dumped, then trudge back up for the next one. They moved tons of earth. Slowly, methodically, a cavern began to take shape in the hillside. It was not a simple hole. It was an engineered space. She followed the plans from Journal 17 with unwavering precision. She dug until she hit the granite shelf her father's geological maps had predicted. This formed her floor, a solid, unmoving foundation. The walls were a combination of exposed bedrock and carefully constructed dry stack stone. She spent weeks selecting the right stones from the creek bed, fitting them together without mortar, creating a wall that was both immensely strong and porous enough to allow groundwater to weep through and be channeled away by a clever French drain she dug along the perimeter. The town saw a woman playing with rocks. They did not see the intelligence behind it. They did not see the careful calculation of load-bearing capacities or the genius of a design that worked with the land's natural tendencies instead of fighting them. Mr. Sterling would sometimes ride his fine black stallion past her property. He would rein in his horse and watch her, a single woman covered in grime, wrestling with stones a third her weight. He would shake his head, a pitying smile on his face, then ride back to his grand house of wood and glass. His house was a statement. It shouted its presence from the ridgetop. Elara's home was a secret. It whispered its existence from within the hill. The most crucial part was the roof. She laid massive, hand-hewn timbers across the top of the stone walls, their ends anchored deep into the surrounding earth. On top of this, she layered waterproofing materials her father had described, thick sheets of birch bark sealed with pine tar. Then came the earth itself. She and Copper spent a month hauling the excavated soil back up the hill, laying it over the roof structure. The journals specified a minimum depth of 3 feet. This thermal mass, her father had written, was the key. It would absorb the summer heat and the winter cold, keeping the interior temperature stable year-round. She planted the roof with native grasses, their roots destined to create a living web that would hold the soil in place. The final exterior elements were 2 stone chimneys, which the town mistook for odd grave markers. They were not for smoke. They were a sophisticated ventilation system. One flue, placed low on the back wall, would draw in cool, fresh air. The other, rising from the highest point of the ceiling, would expel warm, stale air, creating a constant, silent circulation powered by simple convection. Inside, the space was a single large room with a small partitioned area for Copper's stable. The air was cool and smelled of damp stone and fresh earth. It was a scent of safety. She finished the heavy work by late September. The town had long since grown bored of her. The Folly was just a part of the landscape now, a curious scar on the hillside. Elara spent October preparing for the winter. She stocked her larder with preserved foods. She cut and stacked firewood for her small, efficient cast-iron stove. She hauled barrels of fresh water from the creek. Then, she began to notice the signs. It started with the squirrels. They were not just gathering nuts. They were frantic, possessed by a desperate, frenzied energy she had never witnessed. They stripped every pine cone from the trees, hoarding them in caches so large they seemed impossible for such small creatures. Then came the geese. They flew south 6 weeks early, not in their usual majestic V-shaped formations, but in chaotic, panicked flocks that filled the sky with dissonant cries. The air itself began to feel strange. On clear, calm afternoons, a metallic taste would coat her tongue. A deep, resonant silence would fall over the valley, a quiet so profound it felt like the world was holding its breath. She consulted her father's barometer, an old brass instrument she polished every Sunday. The needle had begun a descent. It was not a sharp drop, but a slow, steady, inexorable creep downward, into a range marked on the dial with a single, ominous word. Tempest. Journal 24 was dedicated entirely to anomalous weather patterns. Her father had documented historical accounts of freak storms, of atmospheric conditions that defied conventional meteorology. He wrote of green skies, of a dead calm that preceded winds of impossible violence, of a sudden, catastrophic drop in temperature. He wrote that nature always gave a warning. You just had to be humble enough to listen. Elara listened, and she understood. Something was coming. Something terrible. A part of her, a small, weary part, felt the urge to warn them. She could go to the mayor, show him the barometer readings, tell him about the squirrels and the geese. She walked to the edge of her property, looking down at the lights of Prosperity Creek, twinkling in the dusk. She could see the proud silhouette of Mr. Sterling's house, every window blazing with light. As she watched, she saw 2 figures on horseback ride up to the grand porch. It was Mayor Thompson and Dr. Albright. Mr. Sterling came out to greet them, and the 3 men shared a laugh. Even from this distance, she saw one of them point up the hill. Her hill. She could not hear the words, but she did not need to. She knew the tone of that laughter. It was the same laughter that had followed her all year. She knew then that any warning she gave would be dismissed as more of the widow's madness. They would call her the burrow witch, prophesying doom from her dirt hole. Her warning would only become another chapter in the legend of Elara's folly. So she turned around. She walked back to her silent, waiting home. She made her final preparations. She brought Copper inside, settling him in his stable with fresh hay and water. She sealed the heavy oak door, dropping a thick timber bar into iron brackets. She checked the seals on the 2 small, deep-set windows, which were made not of glass, but of thick, reinforced resin. Then, she waited. The day arrived on November the 12th. The morning dawned with a sky of a colour no one had ever seen before. It was a nauseating, bruised shade of green-grey, and it seemed to press down on the valley, absorbing all sound. The usual noise of the lumber mill was absent. The birds were silent. At precisely 2:17 in the afternoon, the wind stopped. It did not die down. It ceased to exist. An absolute, suffocating stillness fell. In his grand house, Mr. Sterling remarked to his wife that the air felt thick, like syrup. In his office, Dr. Albright found himself unable to concentrate, distracted by the unnatural quiet. In the town hall, Mayor Thompson looked out his window at the sickly sky and felt the first cold prickle of unease. Then came the sound. It started as a low rumble from the west, a vibration felt in the soles of the feet before it was heard by the ears. It grew steadily, deepening into a monstrous, grinding roar. It was the sound of 1,000 freight trains, a sound of pure, elemental violence. From the bruised green clouds they descended. Not one, three. 3 massive, dark funnels of writhing vapor, their tails lashing the valley floor. They moved with a horrifying speed. Mr. Sterling's house was the first to die. He had boasted that his home had more glass than any other in the territory. That glass was its undoing. The windows on the west side shattered inward in a single, explosive instant. The wind, now inside the house, had nowhere to go. The pressure difference was catastrophic. The proud mansion of timber and glass did not collapse. It detonated. It flew apart into 1,000,000 splinters, the sound of its destruction swallowed by the greater roar of the storm. The town of Prosperity Creek was next. The funnels tore through the neat rows of proper log cabins. They peeled roofs off like the lids of tin cans. They plucked entire buildings from their foundations and ground them into dust. The church steeple, the town's proudest landmark, was ripped away and thrown 1/2 mile. The single road into the valley was buried under 100 feet of fallen ancient trees. The railroad tracks were twisted into mangled ribbons of steel. Prosperity Creek was erased. Inside her burrow, Elara felt the world vibrate. The roar of the storm was not a roar to her. It was a deep, muffled hum, the sound of a distant, angry god. The stone walls around her trembled, but they held. The 3 feet of earth on her roof absorbed the impossible pressure changes. She lit a single oil lamp. Its flame barely flickered. She sat at her small wooden table, her father's open journal before her, and she listened to the end of a world. The wind raged for 20 minutes, and then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was gone. The silence that returned was different. It was a dead silence, filled with the ghosts of screams. But the storm was not finished. With the pressure barrier of the tornado system gone, a wall of Arctic air crashed into the valley. The temperature plummeted. 50 degrees. 40. 20. 0. Rain turned to sleet, and sleet turned to a blinding, horizontal blizzard. The survivors of the wind now faced the killing cold. They huddled in the shattered remains of their homes, exposed to the elements. The proud, civilized systems of Prosperity Creek had failed. The supply lines were cut. The structures were gone. There was no shelter. For 2 days, Elara remained in her sanctuary. The temperature inside the burrow dropped from 60 degrees to a stable 55. She burned a few logs in her small stove, not for survival, but for comfort. She ate her preserved peaches and read her father's words. She tended to Copper, who was calm and safe in his stall. On the 3rd day, the pounding began. It was a frantic, desperate hammering on her heavy oak door. She lifted the bar and pulled it open. A figure, crusted with snow and ice, stumbled inside and collapsed on the floor. It was Dr. Albright. His face was a mask of frostbite and cuts. His fine wool coat was in tatters. Behind him, his wife stood shivering, her eyes wide with shock. "Help us," the doctor choked out, his voice hoarse. "Please." Elara looked down at the man who had called her home a tomb, who had dismissed her wisdom as unscientific foolishness. She felt nothing. Not pity, not triumph, only a vast, quiet emptiness. She said nothing. She simply stepped aside, opened the door wider, and let them in. She wrapped them in wool blankets and gave them hot broth from the stove. They were the first. Word must have spread among the survivors. A desperate message passed through the blizzard. The burrow, the Folly on the hill, it was still standing. They came in a slow, miserable procession of the humbled. Families huddled together, their faces etched with horror and disbelief. They came to the one place they had mocked, the one person they had ridiculed. They came to the door of the tomb and begged for life. Elara let them all in. The large room filled with the broken people of Prosperity Creek. She moved among them, a silent, efficient presence. A natural leader emerged, not through words, but through action. She organized them without effort. She rationed her vast stores of preserved food, ensuring everyone had something to eat. She tended to the injured with the supplies from her father's well-stocked medical kit, her practical knowledge of setting bones and stitching wounds far surpassing the doctor's textbook theories in this raw environment. Dr. Albright watched, humbled, as she cleaned the wound with a poultice of herbs he had never read about, a technique that worked better than his own antiseptics. The last to arrive came on the 5th day. A small group was spotted struggling through the deep snow. It was Mayor Thompson, his face a grim caricature of his former pride. He was half carrying another man, a man whose arm was clearly broken, whose face was pale with pain and shock. It was Mr. Sterling. The owner of the lumber mill, the man who had built a monument to vanity, was brought for shelter into the home he had called a grave. He could not meet Elara's eyes. His gaze remained fixed on the earthen floor, the floor of the burrow that had saved him. The blizzard broke a week later. The sun came out, revealing a world of total devastation. A town had vanished, replaced by wreckage and snow. That afternoon, a town meeting was held. It was held in the only public space left, the main room of Elara's burrow. The survivors gathered, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. Mayor Thompson stood before them, not as a leader, but as a penitent. "I was a fool," he said, his voice cracking. "I measured this valley in lumber and profit. I saw progress in things that could be built quickly and stand tall. I was proud." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "My pride, our pride, doomed us. We built houses of sticks and thought they were castles." He turned then and looked directly at Elara, who stood by the stove, watching. "You tried to tell us," he said, his voice thick with shame. "You brought your plans to me, and I laughed. We all laughed. You were right, and we were wrong." He sat down, his confession hanging in the silent air. Then Mr. Sterling rose, his arm in a sling Elara had fashioned. "My house," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "My house was the first to go. I built it to be seen. I built it with vanity. She built with wisdom. My house is gone. Her home saved us all." Dr. Albright stood as well. "I called this place unhealthy. I quoted my books and my professors. My science was arrogant. I was blind to the truth that was being dug into this very hill. The truth is, this is the healthiest place in the valley. It is the only living place." All eyes turned to Elara. They waited for her condemnation, for her anger, for her "I told you so." She gave them none of it. She simply nodded. "Pride is a poor building material," she said, her voice filling the quiet room. "Nature does not care for our titles or our bank accounts. It doesn't recognize mayors or doctors. It respects only preparation. It rewards humility. She looked around at the faces staring back at her. "You did not listen to me," she said. "But the squirrels tried to tell you. The geese tried to tell you. The sky tried to tell you. You have forgotten how to listen. I will teach you," she finished. In the spring, they rebuilt Prosperity Creek. But they did not build it the same. The grand plans were abandoned. The new structures were smaller, sturdier, built with stone and earth as much as with wood. Many families built their own burrows into the hillsides, following the principles of Elara's design. The phrase, "digging a burrow," was reborn. It no longer meant embarking on a foolish endeavor. It became the town's highest compliment. It meant acting with uncommon foresight, with quiet wisdom, and with a deep respect for the world as it was, not as they wished it to be. When we silence those who warn us, we are not punishing them. We are punishing ourselves. Elara lived for another 50 years. She never remarried. She never had children of her own. The town became her family, and its children her students. She remained in her burrow, a solitary, respected sage. She taught them how to read the language of the clouds and the behavior of the animals. She taught them which stones were best for building and which clays were best for sealing. She taught them the lessons from her father's journals, the wisdom of a man who had listened to the earth. She died peacefully in her sleep one winter night, at the age of 91, warm and safe, in the home she had built with her own 2 hands. The people of the new town, the descendants of those she had saved, did not bury her in the town cemetery. They interred her in a small, stone-lined chamber deep within the burrow she had loved. And on the great stone lintel above her door, the door that had opened to save a generation from its own foolishness, they placed a simple bronze plaque. It did not bear her name. It bore her lesson. It read, "She saw the wind in the frantic squirrel, and the cold in the silent sky. She listened when we were deaf. She built when we mocked. In this earth, she saved us from our pride."